That was just like working with a girl that
Good morning.
because he had a shape too.
What is love calling you to do? The world needs Unitarian Universalists to show up for justice with spiritual grounding, generosity, humility, courage, and concrete skills. It is a spiritual practice to choose love over fear, to be brave, to show up when we're called, to occupy space with loving resistance rather than fearful retreat. We are most powerful when we understand that all of the issues we care most deeply about are fundamentally interlinked, and that each of us has a role to play in building a world in which all people can be free and thrive. When we bring our best selves to our justice work, whichever specific issue or campaign it might be, we are choosing to side with love. And now let us light our candles of community. You can light a candle for a joy or a concern, or simply to bring more light to our space together.
Do Lord, oh do Lord, oh do remember me. Oh do Lord, oh do Lord, oh do remember me. Oh do Lord, oh do Lord, oh do remember me. Oh do Lord, remember me. When I'm in trouble, oh do remember me. Oh, when I'm in trouble, oh do remember me. Oh, when I'm in trouble, oh do remember me. Oh, do Lord remember me. When I am dying, oh do remember me. Oh, when I'm dying, oh do remember me. Oh, when I am dying, oh do remember me. Oh, do Lord remember me. Oh, when this world's on fire, oh do remember me. Oh, when this world's on fire, oh do remember me. Oh, when this world's on fire, oh do remember me. Oh, do Lord remember me. Do Lord, oh do Lord, oh do remember me. Oh do Lord, oh do Lord, oh do remember me. Oh do Lord, oh do Lord, oh do remember me. Oh do Lord remember me.
Can you hear me? I think it's the system going in and out a little bit, so it may not be the microphones. Our opening thought comes from Martin Luther King Jr. from his letter from a Birmingham jail. Just as Socrates felt that it was necessary to create a tension in the mind so that individuals could rise from the bondage of myths and half-truths to the unfettered realm of creative analysis and objective appraisal, so must we see the need for nonviolent gadflies to create the kind of tension in society that will help us rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism to majestic heights of understanding and community.
I have decided to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear. I have decided to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear. I have decided to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear. I have decided to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear. Love is gentle, love is kind. Love is the only answer in hard times. Hate solves nothing and brings us down. Love is the only thing that turns it round. I have decided to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear. I have decided to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear. Dream of love, dream with your heart. When setting out in life, make love your start. When times are hard, love finds a way. Even when the word is hard to say, I have decided to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear. I have decided to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear. I have decided to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear. I have decided to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear.
Our first reading comes from Peter Singer from his work Holding Creative Tension. He writes, "The gap between vision and current reality is also a source of energy. If there were no gap, there would be no need for any action to move towards the vision. We call this gap creative tension." Let us now be in a moment of meditation. Many of us carry a burden of worry. Anxiety over the state of the world. Worries about money, about our environment, our families, about peace and justice. May we trust that nothing will get worse for us putting that burden down for a moment. May we let go of what weighs us down. May we find that we can set down worry for longer and longer periods of time. In our experience of letting go, may we be open to the possibility that we need not pick our worries back up. May we find passion and strength to work for change where we have the power to do so, and to let go where we do not. If not forever, let us put down any worries or anxiety for our time of quiet. May we be in quiet together. Our second reading comes from Reflections on Working Toward Peace by Rigoberto Menchú Tum. Even so, the mere absence of armed conflict does not necessarily mean there is peace. Peace is not synonymous with the absence of war. It isn't just the silencing of weapons. For me, peace is a way of life, both for the individual and for all humankind. It is a form of coexistence among peoples, lands, and nations, the deeper meaning of which we might call mature human development, with total equality for everyone, men and women, children and adults. It is equal access to development for all nations and lands, so they may choose their own futures without anyone interfering and telling them what to do.
accomplish still. Drops of water turn a mill. Singly non, singly non.
This semester, I'm teaching a course at Oklahoma City University titled Peace and Nonviolence. It's a required course for our students who are part of the World House Scholars Program for Social and Ecological Responsibility. And we're studying the thought of Mohandas Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Thich Nhat Hanh, Wangari Maathai, and also Malala from Pakistan. And in rereading their works, I have been reminded that one of the common misconceptions about persons who are committed to using nonviolence in their work for social change is that because they are nonviolent, they must be somehow passive and non-resistant. Sometimes this misperception is used by persons and groups who are open to the use of violence to disparage those who are nonviolent as being too passive to bring about the needed social change. Most major nonviolent movements for change have had to address this criticism at some point, especially if the desired social change was slow in coming to fruition. And we know that often the desired social change is slow in coming to fruition. And so when people are beginning to become impatient, they often will be very critical of the nonviolent methods to bring about that change. But the reality is that the persons and the movements that have been successful in bringing about change through nonviolence have not been passive at all in their approach. Quite the opposite. The leaders of nonviolent movements for social change have been active in their resistance to injustice and are continually pressing for justice through action. And often that action is direct action to confront the systems of oppression and bring about more awareness of the injustices that are being perpetuated and the need to bring about positive change. Persons like Mohandas Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Thich Nhat Hanh, Wangari Maathai, Malala Yousafzai, Greta Thunberg, and so many others have shown us that nonviolent resistance is not passive acquiescence, but rather the active use of creative tension to keep moving society towards greater justice in the work to cultivate a beloved community. One of the books that we're reading in my Peace and Nonviolence class is Gandhi's autobiography, which he titles his experiments, My Experiments with Truth. And Mohandas Gandhi comes to realize in his work for the rights of Indians in both South Africa, where he lived and worked for many years, and in India itself, that justice was not something that was simply going to be given to the Indians by the British Empire. That is not what empires do. Justice and independence were things that needed to be relentlessly insisted upon and worked for if they were ever to become a reality. In the years from 1893 to 1914, when I first typed that, I have to admit, I wrote 2014. It's just habit. But in the years from 1893 to 1914, while involved in public service for the Indian people living in South Africa, Gandhi developed an approach to nonviolent social change, which he called satyagraha, which means literally desire for truth. and has often been translated as truth force. Satyagraha is sometimes misleadingly described as promoting passive resistance, but it is more accurately characterized as a philosophy of active, nonviolent resistance. Like many wise persons before him, Gandhi saw clearly that unjust laws are not laws at all, and he believed that it was a moral duty to directly disobey those unjust laws, but to do so strategically, publicly, and nonviolently. The goal was not to vanquish the oppressor, but rather to bring justice for all, with the hope of reconciliation. Gandhi's Satyagraha movement would engage in strikes, fasting, protests, and nonviolent and public disobedience of unjust laws. When Indians in South Africa were forced to be registered for the purposes of discrimination, they burned their registration cards. When the British regulated the production of salt in India, Gandhi and thousands of others marched to the sea to make their own salt in symbolic defiance. When the British restricted the production of textiles in India, Gandhi spun his own clothes and encouraged all other Indians to do so. The Satyagrahis, those persons fully committed to truth force, would sometimes be beaten, but they would not return violence for violence. They were imprisoned by the thousands. And Gandhi would make use of this prison time for reading, meditation, reflection, and planning. The power of a persistent and widespread nonviolent movement proved to be overwhelming for the colonial authorities in both South Africa and in India, as they eventually succumbed to the demands for justice, and in the case of India, demands for its independence from Great Britain. In 1935, one of the most influential African American ministers in the 20th century, a person by the name of Howard Thurman, traveled as part of a 4-member delegation to visit Gandhi in India, where he was leading this nonviolent struggle for independence from British rule. And this visit helped Howard Thurman bring the power of nonviolence to bear on the struggle for civil rights in the United States. And it was during Thurman's time as Dean of the Chapel at Boston University that Thurman encouraged Martin Luther King Jr. to study Gandhi's nonviolent direct action approach and to apply it in the civil rights movement. King himself traveled to India in 1959 to learn from followers and family members of Gandhi, and King's commitment to nonviolent direct action became the hallmark of his approach to the civil rights movement. Like the Indian Satyagrahis before them, King and others led a movement of nonviolent direct action to challenge the injustices of racial segregation and discrimination in the United States. Like Gandhi, King encouraged civil rights advocates to strategically and nonviolently resist unjust laws. They sat in seats on buses they were not allowed to sit in. They sat in diners where they were not allowed to eat. They protested, they marched, and they agitated for racial equality and justice. The African American Satyagrahis, led by King and the civil rights movement, were beaten, doused with fire hoses, bombed, hanged, and shot. But they did not return violence for violence. They too were arrested by the thousands, and King, like Gandhi, made good use of his time in prison for reflection, writing, and planning. And we know one of his most famous writings, The Letter from a Birmingham Jail, was written while he was in prison. The commitment to direct nonviolent resistance played a key role in the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act being signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson in the mid-1960s. It even led King to be recognized with the Nobel Prize for Peace in 1964. But tragically, like Gandhi, it also led to his being assassinated by a person who stood against his movement for justice. The method of nonviolent direct action to cultivate the needed creative tension for social change has been used in many other movements for peace and justice in our world, with powerful results. The work for peace by the Vietnamese Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh that we discussed months ago is another compelling example of nonviolent action for social change through what Thich Nhat Hanh called socially engaged Buddhism. The work of the Nobel Peace Laureate Wangari Maathai in Kenya to plant millions of trees and to work nonviolently for environmental justice in Kenya and beyond, even when she was violently opposed and beaten, is another powerful example of truth force in action. And today we see other models of nonviolent direct action in the work of Malala Yousafzai for the education of girls and women throughout the world, even though she was shot and narrowly escaped death at the hands of the Taliban. And we see the model in the work of Greta Thunberg, who is a force for truth in her nonviolent and relentless work for climate justice and for a livable climate. Greta courageously speaks out to the powers that perpetuate the practices that are hurling the earth towards climate chaos, and she has helped move a whole generation to action. Many who have opposed these nonviolent forces for truth and justice have argued that they are troublemakers, that they are rabble-rousers, that they want way too much, way too fast, and that they are disrupting the law and order of the land. In the name of a false peace and an unjust order, they call for an end to the tension that these nonviolent justice makers are creating. They are the ones Martin Luther King Jr. must have had in mind when he reminded us all during his creative time in prison in a Birmingham jail, quote, that true peace is not merely the absence of tension, it is the presence of justice. Creative justice is not a passive enterprise. It requires action, and sometimes it requires direct action that presses creatively on the places of tension within our society to provoke positive social change. May we all find the spiritual and moral courage to be satyagrahis in this moment, using the nonviolent force of truth to create the tension necessary to cultivate true peace with justice as we seek the beloved community together. And at this time, those who wish may bring their gifts to the table, and you may also find a way to give online.
my mother. When love is gone, my mother. When love is gone, in our darkest hour, hope lingers on, my father. When peace is gone, my father. When peace is gone, in our darkest hour, hope lingers on. I will not hate, and I will not fear in our darkest hour. Hope lingers here, my sister. When equality's gone, my sister. When equality's gone, in our darkest hour, hope lingers on, my brother. With tolerance gone, my brother. With tolerance gone, in our darkest hour, hope lingers on. I will not hate, and I will not fear in our darkest hour. Hope lingers here, my love. When honor is gone, my love. When honor is gone, in our darkest hour, hope lingers on, my country. When justice is gone, my country. When justice is gone, in our darkest hour, hope lingers on. I will not hate, and I will not fear in our darkest hour. Hope lingers here. I will not hate, and I will not fear in our darkest hour. Hope lingers here.
I just thoroughly appreciate how wonderful that song was. Let's stand in body or spirit for our parting thought and the extinguishing of the chalice. Our parting thought comes to us from Wangari Maathai. Human rights are not things that are put on the table for people to enjoy. They are things you fight for and then you protect. Join in the extinguishing the chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.